Welcome. Good morning. I'm Barton Polson, and this is the Data is for Doing live office hour. And today I am thrilled to have a special guest with me, Stacey Gordon of Rework Work, who also, in my book, is an absolute superstar. You may not know this. So I like to think that I have a big reach on LinkedIn Learning with my courses, but Stacey had the #1 most popular course on all of LinkedIn Learning just a few years ago. We're going to talk about some of the principles from her courses. Now, before we get started, I'm going to hopefully things are going to work right, and I'm going to invite you to add a comment if you can to say hello and tell us where you are located. I'm in Salt Lake City, Utah, and Stacey, I believe you are in Los Angeles. Is
I
that?
am, yes, I'm in Los Angeles.
Why don't you take a moment and introduce yourself?
Sure. So I am Stacey Gordon. I am a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, speaker, author, really do just a lot around leadership development, and started my career in the recruitment space and really started focusing in on how do we ensure that everyone really enjoys their jobs. And so even though I'm not doing recruitment anymore, I still do that in the workplace, right? It's about how do we make sure that everyone loves where they work.
Well, that's fabulous. And I want to share just a couple of things. If you were there, this is a shortcut link to Stacey's LinkedIn Learning profile. So bit.ly, LIL for LinkedIn Learning -SG for Stacey Gordon. In fact, if I am able to make this happen, that is even a QR code that will get you there if you need that. Want you to be able to see the things that she has to offer. And in fact, I'm going to take just a moment to share a few things with my screen here. I'm going to do share screen, and I'm going to do window. So for instance, right here, this is Stacey's LinkedIn Learning page. So she's got several courses here: unconscious bias, and then the skills first recruiting. Unconscious bias right here, this was the massive home run. I've done that one too, and we've got several others. Now, in addition to those, if you click on show LinkedIn profile, that'll take you here, and you get her entire profile there and the work that she does. And you can also get connected to her weekly newsletter. I have a hard time writing my newsletter once a month, but Stacey writes hers weekly for 117 times, Lead with Inclusion. And I strongly encourage you to check these out and to see how they connect to your own work. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And Stacey, let's talk a little bit about what do you think are the short list of the most important things for people working in the tech world or just working in general to know about what you have learned in diversity and how it can change people's own work?
So I think an important thing is when it comes to really being open and talking to others. And we are in a terrible political climate right now with just everything that's going on. I hope you're not hearing that noise in the background. Okay. It's hot in Los Angeles, and I happen to have my window open, and so. But I think when it comes to what you really need to be paying attention to, it's like, are we really paying attention to other people around us? And we talk a lot about bias, and I think bias comes into play because we have such narrow viewpoints. And so if we're not paying attention to just the fact that we don't know what we don't know, I think that's the biggest piece. We use the word blind spot, which I know is not politically correct. But I haven't found a really good alternative as yet for that. But there is a place where we don't know what we don't know. And if we're not open to learning, and if we're not open to growing, we're going to continue to make the same mistakes over and over again.
Well, and I think that idea about there's these voids, these empty spots that we're not even aware that they're there. I can think of some silly technical examples. I'm trained as an experimental psychologist, and I learned how to work with data within that paradigm. And I assumed that what I learned was how people worked with data. That's not true. If you're working in health research, if you're working in epidemiology, if you're working in economics, you approach it completely differently. If you're doing market research, you approach it completely differently. And my training in terms of the technical aspects has almost no connection with what's going on over there. But even more importantly, when it comes to running a business or building a data model that can be used for a business, you know, actually, let's start with a funny one. Stacey, you may or may not be aware of this. Do you know what the number one most selling book category is on Amazon? By far,
No, I don't.
romance novels.
Oh, I should know that.
Anybody who works in publishing, anybody who connects with it should know that. Because so often we think like it's like serious novels, quote unquote, just novels, not genre novels. But no, romance novels by far are the biggest category. And so if I were trying to write, you say like, oh, you're missing a gargantuan audience over here. The same thing is true about, we talk about movies and music. There are whole categories that, I can't watch horror movies, but I know
I
that
can't either.
but my daughter and her girlfriend, they're enormously popular films. But even more, I get involved. I'm on hiring committees at my university, and I teach at State University, and I'm in Utah. And part of the problem is not everybody's willing to move to Utah, and 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 so we end up with a lot of people who resemble each other because they're willing to move here and they're willing to work for the price that our state-run university is willing to pay them, which is not nearly enough. And my fear is that, for instance, we're doing our students a disservice because we are presenting a relatively constrained version of what, for instance, psychology and research and statistics and life outside of academia means to them. And I'm sure that's a similar kind of problem you confront in a lot of disciplines.
Well, I think it's like the goal should be, let's teach you the practical, right? This is how you do it. But then understand that then when you actually do it in, the real world, right, out of academia,
Mhm.
that you then do have to, be more open, right, to different perspectives and to understanding that there's more to it. So you can understand the mechanics of how to do it. But
Mhm,
then,
mhm.
and I think that's what school is for, is to teach you the mechanics.
Right.
But then you've got to take those mechanics and actually make them practical. And I think that's where um, we fall short, because we're like, well, this is how I learned it. This is what I'm going to do. And it's like, no, you learned it this way so that you can now apply it in the real world. And we don't always look at that bigger picture. And it's very hard to look at that bigger picture.
Mhm.
There are some exercises that I love to do in my work that helps people to see what you can't see. Because, as an example, I always use this example, which is a really big one, but you don't think about it at all. But that is just the fact that I am mobile, right? I do not have a physical disability. So, what does that mean? It means that I live and work in a building that is not ADA compliant. And I didn't notice that until I'd been living here for 6 months. Because I can just run up the stairs, I can run down the stairs. Like, there is no elevator. To the parking garage, I live on the second floor. There is no elevator. It's an older building, only has 2 stories. And so just to think, I was like, well, what happens if I were to fall and break my leg, right? Twist my ankle. How am I getting, like, this is not a place that would be conducive to me living here, right?
Mhm.
But it also means I can step off the sidewalk, cross the street, and not think about, is there an egress for my wheelchair, right? I was just on a cruise ship. You go to the elevators, everyone's packed like tight like sardines, and you go, I'll just go down the stairs. I can just turn and walk down the stairs. I don't have to think about these things. And
Mhm.
because we don't ever have to think about them, we don't. So we don't take that into account when it comes to anything that we need to do, right? If I'm planning a party here, I don't take into account the fact that I might have a friend, or somebody might want to bring a friend who's in a wheelchair, and they would not be able to attend my party.
Yeah, yeah. There are many, many stairs into our house, and my wife and I often think, yeah, our time with stairs is limited. Um, but it's a wonderful point. It is an issue of, and it's funny because it reminds me of every semester when I teach my classes at the university, I get a collection of accessibility letters. And while they do not ever tell me what the situation is that led to this particular accommodation to be necessary, as they should, but each time I get some very unusual accommodations that I have to make. And um, I mean, I'm teaching a statistics class, and I've had people with diagnosed dyscalculia, a severe math disability. And I thought, how on earth am I going to make this work for this person for whom calculating is dramatically more difficult than it is for other people? My wife is a choreographer who teaches movement for actors in the theater department, and she puts her hands physically on people every day when she's working in class. When the pandemic came along, she had to learn how to do everything without being in the same room or touching people. And it led to dramatic variations, things that she had always assumed. And now she is dealing with um, realizing that no, actually, not everybody's comfortable with her coming up and touching their bodies while they're moving. And she's, it's, I know it sounds kind of obvious, but she's sort of like saying that's how her work has always been done. That's how everybody in the field does it. And realizing, wait a second, this brings up issues, and it just doesn't work for some people. Um, that it's very difficult. So she has been adapting, I think, very effectively to that approach. But it is the idea of things that you weren't even aware of,
Right.
And finding a way to work around those.
Well, things you didn't think, things that you thought were normal to you, and so you're like, well,
Mhm,
of course everybody does this, and
mhm,
then you realize, no, everybody does not, and then
mhm.
you're like, huh, okay, now what do I do? And
Yeah.
having to make that adjustment. And the,
Mhm.
the problem is most people don't want to make the adjustment.
Yeah.
And then there are people who want to make the adjustment, but have no idea how.
Right.
Right. So then it's just easier to say, well, I've always done it this way, so I'm going to do it this way.
Mhm.
And the fact that you can't adjust, that's your problem, not my problem. When it's like, no, actually, it's on you to
Yeah.
make the adjustment
Yeah.
because it's not appropriate to just say, well, this is how I've always done it, and you just have to deal with it.
Mhm. Yeah. Now, I want to mention one of the examples you brought up in your course, unconscious bias, um, and I can't remember. It was under the biases and heuristics part, but and maybe it was representativeness. But there's a common idea. So you may recall that this basically caused a small explosion in the tech world about 3 or 4 years ago, when a programmer at Google wrote a sort of manifesto
Yes.
that men are better at technical work.
Right.
Therefore, only men should be hired here. And they got fired, and then there was this huge, it was a disaster in every possible way. But it's the funny thing, I talk to my students and say, look, yeah, there are, if you're looking at very large groups of people, yes, there will be a difference in group mean. An interesting one, you know, girls and women have higher scores overall in verbal fluency than boys and men do. It's a small difference, but it's reliable, it's consistent. And when you see large groups of people, it's there. But it doesn't say, consequently, we should never have men in any uh, field that involves communication.
But I
Similar,
think we also have to change, right? Like there are things that, so society changes.
yeah.
And if we think about the fact that there were, and I'm going to be off with these statistics because this isn't an area that I spend a lot of time in, but
Mhm.
if I'm not wrong, many years ago, I want to say in the 70s, I say many years ago, it's not that many years ago, but
Mhm.
anyway, in the 70s, there were, I think it was the ratio of women to men in technological roles or even technological what's the word? Studies, basically, right, was a lot closer. There were a lot more women.
Really?
Over time, absolutely. If you look at the numbers, so over time, what has happened is women have been pushed out of tech roles over time. Less and less of them go into tech roles, and less of them are hired in tech roles. So there
I had no
is,
idea.
yeah. But this has happened, right, because of a number of different factors. There's no one specific cause for it.
Mhm.
But one of those causes is the fact that we have people like that idiot who says that men are better at tech. So then there are people in roles who are then advising people and telling women, oh, don't do this instead. Oh, you shouldn't take this major, you should try that instead. Women who were in classes, right, who are raising their hand and not being called on, are being told, oh, this isn't for you, just be quiet. Right? So
Mhm.
all of those things have impact and effect over time and then begin to completely change the way that society has been built up. So it's just a lot of those types of things that happen. And we also have to remember that society is, it's a bell curve, right? So things that we think are obscure on the outskirts today are things that are mainstream in 20 years. It takes about 20 years, right? 20 to 30 years for things to move. So if you think about the fact that everybody and their mother has a tattoo right now, but when I was in college, it was completely frowned upon. You were a degenerate and a drug dealer and like there was something wrong with you if you had a tattoo. You
Mhm.
could not get a job in a bank. You couldn't get a job in a hospital. You couldn't get a job in so many places. Now that has changed dramatically, but it's taken, 40 years. So,
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Talking about bell curves, also another thing is when we talk about abilities in groups, um, to go back, to the Google guy who said men are better at technical fields, and I say, yeah, if you go to like the SAT, the average for men is slightly higher than the average for women. He said, but what you also find is there's more variability. The curves overlap tremendously. And in fact, what you find is, yeah, there's in terms of people who get a perfect score in the math on the SAT, that is going to be a slightly higher percentage of men. But if you also look at people who have severe math learning disabilities, that is also a higher percentage of men than it is women. And so getting the entire bell curve, it gives a very different impression than just this one, easy representative number here. But I wanted to ask you about something that makes life more challenging. I live in Utah, and um, a few months ago, our governor jumped on the bandwagon and signed an anti-DEI law, which actually this happened while we were in the process of doing job searches at the state university where I work, and we immediately had to change the questions that we asked because there were regulations that were very specific about higher education job searches. Um, on the other hand, we know that these issues are really, really important for people like me who are in a situation where we now have legal constraints on what we're actually able to do, but we still know that the principles are very important. Do you have any general recommendations?
absolutely. I mean, I think that trying to ban DEI is like trying to ban civility and respect in the workplace. It's like, okay, sure. You, if you want to do that, that's great. But I mean, excuse my French, but it's asinine. It's ignorant. It is short sighted. It is like the dumbest of dumb. That being said, I think we have to really look at what do we need people to do in the workplace.
Yeah.
I know that when I go to work, I would like to work with people that I can respect. I would
Yeah.
like to work with people who are going to respect me. I would like to work with people who are going to actually have the requisite skills and experience to do their job. And those are the things that we're looking for. So the focus in on DEI I mean, even for me, it's like, yes, I'm a DEI practitioner. But what I'm really talking about with most people is the foundations of just being a decent person in the workplace. And so you can call it whatever the heck you want.
Mhm.
But at the end of the day, what I'm helping people to do is communicate better, to collaborate better, to have humility and respect in the workplace. All of those things fall under DEI. So if we want to call it professional development and leave it at that, then we can, right? And so I think that that's really what we have to be doing. It doesn't need the fact that we even have to talk about DEI as a separate and apart thing is problematic for me, because it's like we don't, it shouldn't be something additional, something extra that we have to be focusing on. It's like if you are an accountant, you should be doing your job in a way that is ensuring that the people around you can do their jobs properly, that you're doing your job properly, and then if you're hiring, you're also, hiring for diversity. But that doesn't mean that you're doing it because you must have one Black person, one queer person, one white person, two gays and an Asian, right? Like, we're not putting in orders in this way. What we're saying is we actually want diversity of thought.
Yep.
However, when you start with diversity of thought, people go, well, that's enough. Let's just talk about diversity of thought. No, because I've heard people say, well, you can have 10 blonde haired, blue eyed white guys in a room and get diversity of thought. Maybe, kind of, right? A little bit.
Spectrum of it.
But you're gonna get this much diversity of thought. Whereas if you do focus and say, well, let's make sure we've got genders represented, let's make sure we have races represented, let's make sure we have cultures represented, right? All the different identities represented, you're automatically going to get diversity of thought, and you're going to get a much broader range. And that diversity is what creates innovation. It is what increases productivity. It is what makes companies sustainable moving forward. So that was my long
Well,
way.
and that's wonderful. I spent for the last 22 years, the department that I've worked in has been an interdisciplinary department with psychology, sociology, anthropology, social work, and family science. I have loved that connections we have between them. And we also have people who do, for instance, do their teaching and their research dramatically different from each other. At the very least, I'm a quantitative person. I do numbers. I have colleagues who are ethnographers, and I am so glad that they are there when we talk about research at a department meeting. They remind us, no, there's more than one way to do this, and it reaches out to different people. I also had a colleague who was, before he became a sociology professor, was a bricklayer for years, and I thought that was so important, in part because one large group that we have at our university that doesn't really get acknowledged very often is we have a lot of rural students. And we have a lot of people from working backgrounds. And so these are some of the smaller elements of what's going on. And anyhow, it does let me know that, yeah, you can have a form of diversity of thought, but I think that the diversity of experience and diversity of really just lived experience is going to be so important to what's going on. And now our time is almost up, and I'm mindful of Stacey's other obligations today. Thank you for making the time here for us. But I just want to say, for those of you who are here, the reason it was so important for me to talk with Stacey today, there are two major reasons. One, of course, is because we all live in a world where we're interacting with each other, and we work for organizations where we're interacting with each other. And the principles that make diversity, equity, inclusion so important in organizations everywhere are going to be important for those working in the data world. The second one is there are some very specific elements of data work that benefit from this. I'm sure you all know about sampling bias, and you know about the failures of machine learning models that do not have sufficiently diverse training data sets. The reason, now I understand that falls into a different category, but there's also reasons to believe that the people who create the algorithms and the people who are running the projects tend to use data sets that line up with their own personal experience, that this is what data looks like. But having a more diverse range of people operating in the data world generally will lead to having a more diverse and generalizable set of data that get included. And so it actually, not only does it make the working environment better, it makes the data environment better as well. And that's one of the reasons that this was so important to me. And we've got just 1 minute. Stacey, is there something you'd like to leave as a close?
I mean, I would say too, the people don't spend time getting to know people who are different from them because I think there's fear, right? There's uncomfortableness. We like to hang around people who look like us, right? There's that affinity bias. And so if you watch my course, you know all about affinity bias, right? And so there is that affinity bias that we have. And the way to get past that is we have to spend time getting to know people who are different from us. And so one of the things we have been doing, our team, is actually our 100K Conversations Challenge, because we're just challenging people to have a conversation with someone who's different from you. Whether in your work life, in your church life, in your religious life, in your home life, your school life, academic life, whatever, because we have to get used to doing this. I think the problem with a lot of the DEI work is we come in and say, you need to do this thing, and we expect you to go do this thing immediately. Implement it, go do it now. There's no space for practice, for trial and error, to get comfortable and really understand what it is that we're doing. And so this is our goal. This is our way to say, look, I want you to try some things. Just go talk to someone, have a different conversation. But I do know that, people will go off willy-nilly and start saying some things. So I put lots of resources together to help with that. So there's some things you can try just to, assist, because I find that sometimes people, start out try to have some very, intimate or hard conversations. And it's like, no, we're not there yet. We're not ready, right? We are still strangers. We need to get to know each other before we dive off the deep end into some of the conversations that we need to have. So I need you to all go out and practice.
That's wonderful. And it's a beautiful day today. It's not yet 100 degrees. So now is a good time to go do that. Stacey, thank you so much for joining me. I'm grateful to have you here. And for those of you, I should have mentioned, we have recorded this conversation and it will be available almost immediately on LinkedIn, on YouTube, and on Facebook. I'll have that on my page. I'll share that with Stacey. She'll be able to share those as well. Folks, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.